Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Active Inference Lab. Today it's September 9th, 2021 for GuestStream number 10.1, double digits or double digits with a decimal. And we're really honored and appreciative to have Professor Philip Gerrans today coming in from Australia, and also Dave joining us on stream. We're going to have a presentation from Philip, and then we're going to have some time for discussion and dialogue. So if you're watching live, please feel free to leave questions in the live chat, and we will address those on the stream. And we're just really looking forward to this, and again, appreciative that you're coming on our stream. So thanks, and take it away, Philip.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. I spoke to Anna Kianika, who told me that she had a great experience with you guys. So I'm very, very happy to be able to present and to tell you a little bit about the background to this talk. I was originally a philosopher of mind, then of cognitive science, and I'm very interested in the use of models and techniques in cognitive science to understand psychiatric disorder. And I found predictive processing very helpful when I was writing a book on this a few years ago. But looking back at some other psychiatric disorders like the kotar delusion and so on, I think it's really great to kind of go a little bit deeper and more fundamental. If you think of predictive processing as kind of like a computational structure at the level of representation and algorithm. But of course, a lot of psychiatric disorders, I think, have got a very sort of a bottom-up genesis. We really need to know about how the brain is working to control the body, and even how the body is working in its social world. So the active inference framework for me has been very helpful in rethinking this in this book that I'm writing right now. And also, I think it's actually crucial to understanding a phenomenon that I'm talking about right now, the kotar delusion. The kotar delusion is so interesting because, well, it's interesting in itself, as you'll see. It's a fascinating phenomenon, but it points us to some really interesting facts or interesting evidence about the way the mind is working at a really basic level, and how that ramifies and cascades upwards throughout cognition and behavior. So let's go. I'll just tell you what the kotar delusion is. It's a delusion of, sometimes people think of it in the folk world as the delusion that you're dead. It was discovered in 1882 by Jules Cotard, but he described it more accurately, I think, as a delusion of inexistence. So here's someone who has it. She had the experience of having no identity or self, and being only a body without content. She'd convinced that her brain had disappeared and the whole body was translucent. Another one, more recent one, I speak and breathe and eat, but I'm dead. Okay, so there's some classic examples, but here is a really recent one, published in the last couple of years. This is fascinating cases coming from Mexico. There's a really good group there that works on this. So Mr. A was referred to the National Institute of Neurology because of psychotic and catatonic symptoms. His appetite diminished, he barely slept, he stayed withdrawn and silent. He'd complain about his body, saying his tendons were dried up and his organs were getting bigger. Speak of an internal hemorrhage, his organs had been torn apart. He began to insist that he was dead. I can't feel the blood flowing through my veins. Didn't deprive him of looking for sharp objects to cut his neck and forearms. Then he gradually improved, or first he became mute, began to urinate on his clothes, refused to eat and speak. Finally, after some treatment, he said he's improved slightly, but he said, I don't have feelings because I'm dead. He had a right-sided heart, and that had stopped. And then he kept on saying, even after persisting treatment, his nihilistic delusions, as they're accurately called, delusions of inexistence, of nothingness. I am dead. Among other human beings, it's like a program where I'm dead. And he said he was a dead person among the corpses under the earthquake debris. Now, the genesis of this case of kotar delusion is encephalitis, a form of encephalitis where it's an autoimmune reaction against proteins in the brain. So it's one of the most basic things that can go wrong at the cellular level. And if the protein is N-methyl D-aspartate, the condition is called NMDAR, antibody encephalitis. Okay, so that's what Mr. A had. But of course, our interesting question is, if we know what's happening, at the molecular level, at the level of kind of membranes and receptors, why on earth would that make you think that you didn't exist? So there we're in the field of addressing the question, how does the brain enable experience and cognition? That's the questions of cognitive neuroscience and psychology, and anyone else who wants to get involved in that topic, phenomenology philosophy. Okay, but it's a really pertinent question. So here's the outline of the talk. I just told you about the delusion, and then I'm going to tell you about some of the classic attempts to explain it. Just run through those and point to a problem with those. And then in discussing one of the most recent and persuasive and really interesting explanations that we owe to Alexandre Bion, I'm going to introduce the active inference approach, and I'm going to show how the active inference approach can rectify a problem with Bion's account, but also point to some other deep sort of unifying themes across cognitive science and across disorders. So the active inference framework, I think, gives an elegant and persuasive way to explain not just cases like Mr. A, but a lot of other disorders and pathologies where our experience of ourself goes astray. So things like pain asymbolia, where people say that they're experiencing pain, that their body is experiencing pain, but it's not happening to them, or that it feels as though it's not their pain. Or depersonalization disorders, in which people will say not just that pain is not theirs, but they feel outside of or detached from their whole experience. Okay, so, and the solution that I'll propose, I'll give you the short summary right now, is that as part of the project or process of active inference, the brain makes hierarchical models of itself and the world, of the deep structure of the world, as populated with objects and properties, the external world with which it interacts. But of course, the brain also has to make a model of its own internal functioning, the processes that keep us alive and functioning. And in order to do that, it makes a model of itself as a unified persisting entity. And that's what we feel the self, that's what we feel when we feel like persisting people. When we feel like a self, we are the model. That's what we're experiencing, activity in the circuitry that makes that self model. Okay. And in a kotar delusion, there's the self model goes wrong in a certain way, or that process of self-modeling goes wrong in a certain way, but we can see other disorders in which that process of self-modeling goes wrong. And I think that theory maps really nicely to the neural substrates of all these disorders. It explains the symptoms and so on. So let's go. So of course, as we saw, such an interesting disorder, the kotar delusion, because there's questions in sort of philosophy and about rational belief fixation and so on. I mean, how could someone coherently say, I've died or I don't exist? And there's a question about rationality there and the nature of reasoning and so on the basis of experience, which is interesting in itself, that's part of the philosophy of delusions, I guess, or the philosophy of psychiatric disorder, where I came into this topic a while ago. But of course, it's also very interesting in, okay, how can you also have the experience of not existing? So it points us to the question of what is going on when you actually feel like a self, okay? And of course, it's also a great test case for theories that try and explain experience and cognition in terms of underlying neural functioning. So here's the kind of broad brush of the kind of classic approaches to these topics that you get in theories of delusion since, I guess, the early 90s, which tried to wed philosophy of rational belief fixation to the neuroscience of delusion formation. And the most top-level abstract way of putting it is there's two stages in delusion formation. The first one, is an unusual or anomalous, as they say, sensory experience. So something goes wrong, at the level of sensory motor functioning, gives you an unusual experience. And then the second stage is a metacognitive response to that experience. So this is why someone, for example, who lost control or was unable to feel like they were the agent of their actions when they were picking up things and moving around the world. Okay, that's the loss of, as they call, sense of agency due to normally problems in the parietal lobule, inferior parietal lobule. Something goes wrong there with the kind of sensory motor inaction of agency, and then the person will say, to explain that weird experience of moving around the world but not feeling like they are the person who initiated the movement or controlling it, they say someone else is controlling me. So delusions of control, as they say. That would be a classic case. We have an anomalous experience at the first stage, and then the delusion is a belief or some kind of metacognitive rationalization or story that the person tells. Okay, now there's two implications of the two-stage theory. One is that, well, if the patient doesn't have a problem with higher order processing, then she won't develop a delusion, because a delusion is a metacognitive response, right? In that case, the person should have an anomalous experience. She should feel like she's making movements that aren't hers, for example. Or you might feel like you're hearing voice. You might feel like you're hearing voices, and the person will just report that. Having an unusual, weird, distressing experience, but they wouldn't go on to have a delusion, because the delusion is the result of a problem at the stage of, as they call, belief fixation or metacognition. Okay. And if this is really right, then there should be cases in which people have the unusual experience, but they don't go on to have a delusion. And of course, we are all familiar with this in everyday life. If you think about it, you've probably had feelings of déjà vu or jamais vu. In déjà vu, you think, I've been here before. I've had this experience before, even though you know that you haven't. Okay, and this is the point, that you can have an experience that is completely anomalous or weird, don't go on to have a delusion about it. Okay, and in this case, you say, well, it feels as if I've been here before. Or in the opposite case, jamais vu, you walk into your bedroom and it feels, where you sleep every night, but you just have this fleeting instant of, what, this is new, or this feels like a duplicate of my bedroom or something, but you don't go on to form a delusion, because rational insight is retained, unlike the classic case of delusions of misidentification, which I spend no time on. In a delusion of misidentification, a person will say something like, I'll see their wife or see their husband or boyfriend or something and say they're a stranger. See, and you say, why do you say that? Do they look the same? As their appearance changed? And then they look identical, but they are like a replica or a duplicate or an imposter in the classic delusion. And the story is, what has gone wrong here is there's a problem at the level of sensory processing. The thought is that normally when we see a familiar face, we get an affective response to that face, which is part of a signal that that's a familiar person. I see you, I see my sister or my partner, and then it's like, oh yeah, that's her. So it's a feeling of familiarity that's based in affect. But when that goes missing, then all the other perceptual information is intact. I recognize the face, the shape of the face, and so on, but they don't feel familiar. And in the case of delusions of misidentification, the person rationalizes these losses or alterations to the sense of familiarity by saying, oh, my wife's been replaced by an imposter. Okay, amazing delusions, but there you go. But that's just an example of the kind of two-stage theory of delusion formation, which was developed for delusions of misidentification. Now, in turning to the kotar delusion, what is the first stage within this framework? Well, Alexandre Bion says that it's the loss of what people call the sense of mindness, or subjective presence is what Anil Seth calls this, and people from Sussex who work on depersonalization. The basic idea is that something that philosophers and many people have remarked on, thought about, is that when you have experiences, part of that experience is an awareness that you are the person who's having experience. As Jaspers said, every psychic manifestation, perception, bodily memory, it carries with it this feeling of being mine, and having an I quality of personally belonging. It's been termed personalizations. And so the thought is, just as when you see familiar people, there's this kind of subtle, just this little subtle feeling of familiarity, which you don't even notice that it's there until it goes missing. And so it's the case that with your everyday experience, it feels like it's yours. I mean, who else? So there's this kind of aspect of subjectivity or subjective presence that you wouldn't even become aware of until it went missing. We only see it as, we only even notice that this is an experience, a kind of subtle accompaniment to all of life, until we are confronted with, as Bion says, exceptional and pathological cases. And then if it goes missing, you're really in trouble. Right? So, for example, in the case of pain asymbolia, what can happen is that someone can have a pain, they can have the experience of pain, and they can report that experience of pain, saying, "Yeah, I'm in pain, but it doesn't feel like it's my pain, or I feel detached, like it's not happening to me." And on interrogation, you say, "Yeah, it feels hot. I feel kind of pressure. It feels intense." In other words, they can be still able to detect and represent bodily damage through the process of, as it's called, nociception, the primary representation of pain stimuli. Okay, but something else has gone missing, right? And what in this nice, there's two theories about pain asymbolia. One is that what's gone missing is an emotional response to pain. So that would be the thought that in the normal case of pain, you have nociception, the detection and representation of bodily damage. And then there's, if you like, an affective or an emotional response or interpretation to that. And the resultant pain experience is like a merger or combination, bodily damage plus distress. And that's what you report. But when you take the distress part out, you just get the representation of bodily damage. That's one theory of pain. But Colin Klein had a different account. And on Colin Klein's view, it's not a loss of affect, not a loss of affect. It's a loss of the sense of mindness. So asymbolia, on his view, is a localized version of depersonalization experience. Asymbolia is, if you like, a restricted case just to the pain processing, where the connection between the processing of bodily damage, or nociception as it's called, and this subtle feeling that the experience belongs to you comes apart. So as he says, this sort of unity may fail. Okay, and that this leads to what he calls depersonalization for pain, as opposed to depersonalization in the general case, where the loss of the sense of mindness is not just for pain, but for everything. So someone with severe personalization disorder will move through life, having sensations of movement, perceptual sensations, bodily experiences, but feeling as if those things don't belong to them. As someone says here, it feels almost like I have died, but no one has thought to tell me, so I'm living in a shell that I don't recognize. I felt my brain was somewhere else and just watching me. I couldn't tell whether I was present or whether I was the part that was gone. There was the one watching and the other. It's like seeing life as if it were played in a film or a movie. But in that case, who is watching the film? I find myself regarding existence as though from beyond the tomb. I'm outside my own body and individuality. I'm depersonalized. So just to recap, okay, Klein gives us the idea that in pain asymbolia, you lose this sense of mindness or belonging to me for one particular channel of bodily processing, that's nociception or pain signaling. But in depersonalization, this loss is global. Right? And when the loss is global, the person reports depersonalization for everything. And the feeling there is like, well, they say it feels as if I don't exist. It feels like I'm not there, right? And so how should we explain what's going on here? Well, there's different theories. Bion has one. I had one 20 years ago. It's a bit out of date now, I think. I'm updating it today, even as we speak. And then we have the one I'll be talking about today, which we owe to the active inference guys like Seth, Sakiris, and so on. But here's Bion's take on it, which is very interestingly. So what Bion says is that depersonalization is this case of an anomalous experience. And the anomalous or strange experience is the feeling that the self is unreal and is not there. And so if we go back to the Cotard delusion, remember the two-stage theory of delusion is that a delusion arises when you have an anomalous experience and then you have some problem at a higher level of rational interpretation, narrative organization, or metacognition, so that you have no rational insight into the experience or are unable to explain it, or you end up just taking it for granted. Right? And that's Bion's idea about depersonalization. It's the first stage of Cotard delusion. So when someone with depersonalization says, it feels as if I don't exist, it feels as if I'm not here, it feels as if experience is outside me or I'm not involved in it, that's because they're having the same experience as the Cotard patient has, but they have rational insight and intact metacognition. So they can, as it were, look at that experience and say, it feels as if I don't exist. It feels as if the experience isn't mine, but I know that's not true. So I report it just saying it feels that way, but they don't develop the delusion. So what differentiates Cotard and depersonalized delusions is that the Cotard patient has the same experience as a patient with depersonalization, but they have intact rational insight. Okay. Now, that's the philosophical angle, but recently, this very interesting group of guys in Mexico have a neuropsychiatric version of Alexandre Bion's two-stage account, which is they explain Mr. A's case, the man who thought that his organs had dried up and that he was dead. He has insular cortex dysfunction, and that insular cortex dysfunction is the first factor. Okay, so the insular cortex dysfunction produces the experience of depersonalization, the feeling that one's sensory experiences and cognitions don't belong to the subject, or and then there's a prefrontal cortex dysfunction that produces the second factor. So this is the story. Look on the left, you've got the first stage. Insular cortex produces this anomalous subjecting feeling state. So if you have hypoactive insular cortex, or maybe lesion, or neurochemical disruption, then you're going to have insular cortex problems, and that's going to lead to the feeling that experiences are not yours in some way. That could manifest as pain asymbolia, depersonalization, or it's also in alexithymia, which we needn't talk about today. But in any case, that gives rise to this abnormal sensory state, or they call it here abnormal perception. So something has gone wrong with your ability to feel that experiences belong to you, thanks to your insular cortex dysfunction. And then if you also have prefrontal cortical dysfunction, then you can't explain that. You have no rational insight into that. And so you end up with the delusion. Now, just to recap, the assumption here that's shared by Bion and by Ramirez Bermudez and his collaborators is that the first stage is essentially the same or similar between depersonalization experiences and Cotard delusion. Okay, so the anomalous experience of depersonalization with rational insight, well, that's depersonalization. But if you have the anomalous experience of depersonalization with no rational insight, then you get the Cotard delusion, right? And the result, and this is because of hypoactivity or lesion maybe in your insular cortex. But this is where I want to go today. This is wrong, right? This doesn't fit with the phenomenology of Cotard syndrome or the neural basis of Cotard syndrome, which is typically a profound and catastrophic reconfiguration of the bodily and affective life world of the patient. It's not a restricted quasi-perceptual deficit, and it's not just insular cortical dysfunction. Because look at the variety of conditions in which you see Cotard delusion. Just some, right? Affective disorders, schizophrenia, syphilis, encephalitis, hemorrhage, malformations, brain neoplasm, cancer, migraine, Parkinson's disease, dementia, right? This widespread, catastrophic conditions of, neural malfunction. And then you see a kotar delusion. It's not just the insular cortex hypoactive. Okay. And not only that, it's not just kotar delusion doesn't look like a just like, oh, it feels as if I'm not here. If you go back to the initial description of the symptomology, it's not just I feel like I have intact perception and cognition, but just feels like it's not mine, or I feel detached from it. I mean, typically someone with kotar delusion undergoes like completely profound and quite catastrophic reconfiguration of their whole life experience. They feel like their body is expanding or contracting, or that guy felt as though his organs had dried up. They can't sleep. They stay urination and sexual function and everything goes to crazy. Their appetite is out of whack. It's a complete catastrophic breakdown. Often it's progressive, but there's no doubt about it that it's a catastrophic breakdown. Okay. So there's a first one. We can disagree with the foundational assumption, but at the same point, it is true that insular malfunction is associated with kotar with depersonalization. I beg your pardon. So let's look at that first. And it's also true that insular malfunction, among other things, is profoundly involved in kotar delusion. And I think we can see why. And this is where active inference makes its appearance, enter stage right. Active inference theory, active inference and predictive processing provide this really nice framework to tie all these ideas together to explain depersonalization, kotar, asymbolia, and to fit together the kind of neural correlates, the phenomenology and symptomology. Okay. Well, first let's start with the kind of the restricted thing. Let's talk about depersonalization. Why would insular damage lead to depersonalization? Why would it be the case that if you had hypoactivity in your insular cortex, you would feel like your experience wasn't happening to you? It's a pretty interesting and amazing sensation. Well, the reason is that the insular cortex, it does a lot of things. It does, as they say, it's an enigmatic and ubiquitously involved neural structure. It's very kind of deep. It receives afferents from almost everywhere. It communicates with almost every part of the brain. Okay, and you'll see it involved in so many things. So it's always been very hard to work out a particular function that the insular cortex does, right? It's not like, for example, looking at part of the visual cortex that, processes wavelength information or something like that, or is involved in, these neural circuits are involved in determining movement or trajectory or something like that. It's not like that. The insular cortex somehow seems to contribute to so many things as an integrative, as a device of integration, and I would say as a device of organization and coordination. And it's like a relay station actually between all these other different things. But the posterior insular cortex is very important in somatosensory, vestibular, and motor integration. Okay. So the posterior insular cortex is basically involved, I would say, in integrating all the information about what's happening in your body. Right? While the anterior insular cortex, which is our real culprit here, has projections to limbic regions, which are one of the substrates of emotional processes, and is associated with integrating autonomic and visceral information. In other words, the basic information about how your body is functioning. My blood pressure, my blood acidification, oxygenation, state of my organs and so forth. This kind of really basic, keeping you alive kind of information, integrating that with emotional, cognitive, and motivational functions. In other words, and here's the killer, it brings internal signals into consciousness and emotional interpretations, supporting the neural constructions of subjective feelings. So just to go, let me stay here for a moment. So the thought, that we get with people like Bud Craig and everything like that is that the anterior insular cortex basically takes all these signals about what's happening on the inside of your body. My blood pressure's up, my heart is beating, whatever, my organs are functioning well or not, and integrates that with all the other cognitive systems that are telling you what's going on outside, what you see, what you hear, what you smell, and the higher cognition, what you remember, what you imagine, what you're thinking about. Okay, and it integrates all this, in other words, to allow you to create, if you like, a representation of how what is happening in the world is interacting with what's happening inside my body to enable me to function adaptively in context. And as they say, well, what is that except a sense of self? The sense of self, or representation of the self, is I'm the thing that has to manipulate my body around the world to interact and engage adaptively with it. And to do that, I need to integrate all the information that's relevant to that task. That's what we need a sense of self for. And that's what the anterior insula does. The anterior insula looks down at the bodily processing, looks out to the world, and integrates them to give you a sense of, as I say, subjective feeling in the moment. Now, so with that in place, we can see why when anterior insula goes wrong, or malfunctions, you might get the sense of not being involved in experience. Now, the most persuasive, I think, explanation of how this might go wrong is that it's a dissociative response to trauma. This comes from Medford, Sierra, and David, the people who work on it. But they explain it in kind of emotional terms. So they call the result as emotional numbing. So the thought is you're having a traumatic experience, you're being raped or being bashed, or maybe you're in a destructive, abusive environment. And as a way of coping, your brain shuts down the anterior insular cortex. It just turns it off. And what is the result? You still end up, seeing, feeling, thinking, and so on, but you don't have the kind of effective, as I say, effective response. Or as Sierra puts it, you no longer have the emotional coloring of experience. So it leads to a qualitative change of conscious awareness, which is reported by the subject as unreal or detached. So the basic idea is you shut down affective processing so that you can cope with extreme distress or trauma. And to shut that down, you shut off the anterior insular cortex, so you no longer feel that it's happening to you. So you can see what you have here is really an affective or an emotional theory of self-awareness. The basic idea is self-awareness is really created by the emotional coloring of experience. Okay, and when that is gone, you end up in an emotionally monochrome world, so to speak. And there's some evidence that lack of anterior insula is related to a diminished emotional responsiveness seen in DPD, and that if the insula comes back online, not only do they restore their affective responses, then they start to feel that this feeling of detachment and disengagement disappears. I just make the point that this theory of this inhibitory theory of depersonalization as dissociative, it really requires a predictive processing framework, because it's not just the fact, for example, that the subject doesn't feel affective responses. It is the fact that it doesn't feel affective responses in contexts or conditions where they are predicted, where they should occur. So depersonalization arises when, take a mother who's just given birth, and then someone gives her the child to cuddle or nurse, and she doesn't feel anything, right? Or you come home from a long trip, your children run up and jump into your arms and give you a big hug, you don't feel anything. Or, you hear bad news, you hear terrible news, someone close to you has died or whatever, you don't feel anything. Now, it's not just that you don't feel anything that's the problem, it's that your mind predicts that you should. Your mind has this kind of ongoing model of the world and you in the world, that your progress through the world and your interactions with the world will be, as they say, emotionally colored. And these emotional colorings are affective responses which get you around the world. And when that's gone, right, it's not just that it's gone. So, because we have plenty of experiences that are emotionally neutral, walking down the street, doing your tax return, reading a book you're not especially interested in, all that kind of jazz. Listening to a talk, going to a department meeting, right? Well, that is a slightly distressing experience, but you know what I mean. The mere fact that there's no affective response doesn't make you feel depersonalized. It's the loss of affective response in a condition where your mind predicts it. It's the disjunction between, or the contradiction between, there should be affect and now there isn't. And that's reported by, then that's the thought is, I feel like I'm not here. Okay. And so the hypothesized mechanism is that you in a traumatic situation and it's too much for your brain to deal with. So these inhibitory processes kick in to shut down the affective response in the moment as a dissociative response. And it's an inhibition of the anterior insular cortex by these inhibitory structures. Okay. And this is exactly what I just said. Why that produces depersonalization is because affective experience is important in getting around life, and also it's predicted. Your mind's model of you acting in the world is that you will have affective responses to the world. But here's where the affective inference starts to kick in. Okay, so then the question is, how does the mind predict that your progress through the world will give rise to affective experiences? How does it do that? Well, I think it does so in a process of what is called, in active inference framework, predictive processing framework, hierarchical self-modeling. Okay. And basically, hierarchical self-modeling is, as I said before briefly, that just as the mind, makes models or representations of the external world, the world out there, in terms of its causal structure, then the mind has to make a model of what's going on inside the body in terms of its causal structure. And the way the mind does this is by integrating all the properties and features of the world and attributing them to unified, persisting causes. Well, that's objects. In the case of the external world, that unified, persisting causes are objects. You don't see smears of colours and movements and changes. You see cars driving down the railway. You don't see these kind of weird interacting shapes and properties. You see people's faces smiling and so on. So it's kind of obligatory strategy for the mind to integrate properties and features by attributing them to underlying objects, or in the case of substances, if you want to call it that, unified persisting things. All right, and that's what we do in outward. And the idea of the self-modeling framework is that's what we do inward as well. The mind's obligatory strategy is to unify and integrate when there are regular, coherent, predictable flows and sequences of experiences or sensory information. The mind explains that, if you like, interprets it, predicts it by attributing it to the same object. And this happens at multiple levels, right? At the most basic level, you have to integrate all these different homeostatic functioning, blood pressure, visceral dilation, vascular dilation, all this kind of stuff that keeps you going. Well, actually, you don't. That is actually integrated by attributing all of those things as occurring in the same entity, and we feel the result in an interoceptive state. Interoception being the internal analog of perception. So an example which makes this point well, I think, is fatigue, right? Well, when you are fatigued, right, what do you feel? You feel like, I'm fatigued. The thing, the embodied thing feels depleted, but you don't feel all these individual streams of, glycogen depletion, adenosine depletion, slow metabolism, all that. You just get the kind of overall vibe of, I'm tired, right? And that's good, because then you can go to sleep. You don't have to fine tune. Anyway, you can't get in there and change your glycogen levels or anything like that. You can just eat. So hunger is another example of a kind of interoceptive sensation that is, this does this kind of aggregative and integrative thing. And this kind of type of self-modeling, this is very familiar from the predictive process, takes place at multiple levels. given the kind of imperatives that we have to survive. Okay, so let me just spend a little bit of this. Okay, within the active inference framework, okay, the most basic task of any organism, self-organizing system, is to survive. It has to maintain its physical integrity, its boundary with the world. It has to take in energy from the world, it has to, and so on. It has to engage with the world, take in energy from the world, and then it has to do something with that energy to maintain itself, to keep all its components interacting. So that's at the most basic physical level. Organisms avoid this inevitable tendency to thermodynamic decay that we all face, and the probabilistic analog of that is they avoid entropy. They have to keep themselves in a state far from entropy by taking in energy and using it. And of course, at the biological level, what does that actually mean? That means staying alive, surviving, prospering in the world. And when we look at the physiology, okay, then obviously we're talking about homeostatic mechanisms. We're talking about mechanisms of self-maintenance for a discrete, unique individual, so to speak. Now, there can be obviously cases where borderline cases of homeostasis where organisms are dependent on other organisms. For example, there are lots of cases where there's a kind of crisscrossing of boundaries, but let's keep it simple for the moment. Think of a cell or think of an organism. Got to maintain their basic functioning, and that's what we refer to as homeostasis or allostasis, a slightly larger, more sophisticated concept. So these are the kind of basic physical imperatives. But of course, to do that, there has to be a lot of signaling within the system. The levels of endocrine function, levels of blood pressure, levels of blood oxygenation, they are signaled to a brain or a proto-brain or a mind, if you want to call it that. And that signaling, requires that the organism, in some sense, implement or maintain a model which predicts what is optimal for it, how far it's departing from optimal, and whether the actions that it's taking to get back into optimal range are successful. And when it can do that, when it can successfully model itself, then it's minimizing what they call variational free energy. And the surprise here just refers to departure from the predicted optimal state given the organism's action. Now, if that sounds too abstract, just think, here's your brain, and you're starting to ride your bike up a hill or walk upstairs, okay, and you have a kind of good optimal range of heartbeat function and blood oxygenation, okay, but that needs to change now because you're walking upstairs, right? You need more oxygen in your blood, you need to work harder and raise your heartbeat. So your mind, sends, if you like, brain sends instructions, raise heartbeat. This is all at the kind of signaling level. It's quite dynamic. If your heartbeat goes up, that's good. It should be up when you're going upstairs, and it should be up if you're riding your bike up a hill. So you've minimized, free energy. You've stayed within your optimal bound, okay, and you're not getting in any information that's out of the kind of predicted, that violates a prediction, a model for that situation. But let's say that you come back downstairs and you sit down and you're resting and having a drink, and your heartbeat is still racing. Well, that's outside optimal range. That's not what your body and mind, predict for that situation. Your brain doesn't think, but now there are signals saying this is out of kilter. I'm sitting on my couch and my heartbeat is 200, all right, or I'm sweating furiously, but I'm not riding my bike, okay, and it's not 40 degrees outside. What's going on? So a lot of signaling going on all the time about whether and how you are optimizing your bodily function. And so that's just at the level of signaling, and some of that's very, very dynamic and leads to these kind of automatic adjustments. But of course, at a higher level, when you talk about cognition, well, what you can think of the mind, or as what we call cognition, as a construction of sort of representational or computational systems, that exploit these informational properties, or that organize these informational and signaling properties, so that we end up with a representational architecture. That's how we get perception, memory, sensory motor control, and so on. And that's what the theory of computation gives us for understanding the mind. It gives us what the theory of computation basically is, in its most abstract, is turning information and signaling into representations that can be manipulated. Okay, translate these abstract ideas into the idea of self-modeling, and we get something like this. We get, okay, at the very basic level of organismic function, then you have allostatic or homeostatic integration. Your mind is kind of, your brain is looking around. Am I in or out of optimal functioning? All this signaling is going on. And what we call interoception is the integration of those processes, okay, which attributes them to the thing which is being regulated, the thing which is being managed, okay, the thing in which all of these processes have to cohere to enable adaptive functioning. And then we get a readout of that. And the readout is your interoceptive feeling, fatigue. If you feel tired, that's because, glycogen depletion, adenosine levels have changed, metabolism is slow, blah, blah, blah. Muscles are weaker and not contracting as fast. And you feel that as fatigue, as it's integration of all of those allostatic variables. And that happens, basically the job of the posterior insular cortex, written there as PI, is to do that. That's where all that stuff coheres, right? That's where all of that stuff coheres. Then, of course, there's not just the issue of how is my body functioning? That's one thing. Okay, is my body de-energized? Well, yeah, that's important to know. But then there's a separate kind of what we might call higher level issue of the meaning and significance of those bodily processes for you in context, right? So if your heartbeat is racing and you're riding your bike up a hill or going for it in the gym, that's a good thing, right? That shouldn't cause you any particular distress. You will feel that as exhaustion. But if your heartbeat is racing because you're waiting for your cancer test, and the doctor has just come out of his office, and he's looking at your chart, and he's looking at your ultrasound with a look of concern and worry. Now your heart is racing, right? Why is it racing? Because you're worried that you might have cancer. That's a different thing, but the point is that the feeling is different. The feeling of worry, distress, anticipatory, anxiety, well, that is characterized by racing heartbeat and feelings of tension and so on. But that's the same bodily signature that you can get when you're powering uphill on your bike or something like that. So the level of heartbeat in itself is, as it were, affectively or emotionally neutral. What that level of heartbeat depends on and how you should react to it, well, that's a product of the kind of emotional context. And to understand the emotional context, that's when you need to bring in the rest of your perceptual, memory, and so on faculties, and indeed your self-representation of, how I am functioning in the world. And so to do that, you need to interpret, or as put it here, transcribe those bodily feelings into emotional feelings of sadness or anxiety or whatever they are. I've given the example here of fatigue because it comes up later, but it's also a good one, right? If you're fatigued, if you're just tired, well, that is a certain bodily feeling, no doubt about it. But if you're depressed, someone who's got persistent depression, they also feel fatigued. They feel tired, lethargic, apathetic, unmotivated, unenergetic. But fatigue in an episode, bodily de-energization in an episode of sadness is experienced differently to just fatigue. That's the point, right? And why is that? Because in an episode of sadness, the world and your prospects in it have been appraised or evaluated or cognized, choose your term. That is because your mind has basically determined that the world for you is a site of irretrievable disconsolation. There's losses in there that you can't recover or recapture. And of course, so that produces the feelings of sadness. Okay, so why does this? So when we translate this into self-modeling, you've got the kind of physical level of bodily functioning and the kind of homeostatic and signaling stuff. But then in order to interpret the significance of all of those changes, you need a model. The mind needs a model of your organism and how it's functioning in the world and what it should expect from the world and the kind of affective consequences that it should get from the world. And so it makes multi-level self-model. At the most basic level, the mind models itself as as a unified entity in which all of these bodily signals cohere, and then it can use that model to regulate the body. You can go to sleep if you're tired. At a higher level, slightly, the mind models itself as the entity that has these feelings of sadness, these affective feelings, these feelings of sadness, anxiety, or these feelings of happiness, pleasure, resentment, all these subtle feelings that are modulated by your actions as you go through the world. So just as you need a model of the bodily functioning to model the body at a basic level, to control to get through the world, well, we get through the world by acting to manipulate our feelings. So we need a higher level model of ourself as the subject of affective states. Okay, and at a still higher level, we report those feelings in a kind of verbal, narrative way. I'm late for work. I'm studying. I'm practicing gymnastics. I'm married, etc. All these things. Well, this is just the high level narrative self model that we use to report our feeling. We use to report our states and communicate them and engage with other people. And so we engage at this narrative level. There's a narrative level self model that's kind of linguistic, but the narrative level self model is supported by an affective or emotional level. Because as we engage with other people and report our states, what we're doing is doing that to change the way we feel, to feel better. And at a still lower level, those affective feelings, what are they? They are transcribed bodily feelings. That is to say, they are emotionally interpreted bodily feelings. So the self-model is hierarchical. At basic level, it's bodily. At a higher level, it's bodily as interpreted for its emotional significance, and at the highest level, it's narrative. Now, here's the hypothesis about all these disorders. In a kotar delusion, the self-model just disintegrates from the bottom up, right? It just falls to bits. It falls to bits at the physical level, right? In other words, the system becomes unregulatable and unpredictable, right? The mind is sending signals: control sleep, control appetite, control metabolism, control movement. Get up to it, but they're not getting any traction. They're not getting any feedback. The whole kind of modeling structure is disintegrated, so that what the mind learns, so that the mind actually can't make a model which predicts the functioning of the organism. It still has this kind of sensations of organismic function, but they're not integrated, unified, and modeled as belonging to a continuing thing, and that's precisely because that model is made for the purposes of regulation. Right? And when the body becomes unregulatable, the mind learns that there is no model that's going to predict and regulate its behavior. Okay? So in other words, if you think of the self as a model that the mind makes at the most basic level for regulatory purposes, then when it's completely unregulable, the mind learns that there is no model that can do the job. Okay. What's that? Oh, yeah. So that's my explanation of Cotard. Okay. Well, but in depersonalization, it's not quite like that, right? Because in depersonalization, basically the model is intact. Okay. The model is intact. You've got kind of controllable bodily functioning. You've got cognition, perception, and so on, all working. But the only thing is that the affective processes have been inhibited. So this kind of you're seeing the world, feeling the world, touching and engaging with the world, but there's no affective responses to the world because they've been shut down as a dissociative response. So now you've got an intact self-model, but you can't annex or incorporate affective states into it. So that's why in depersonalization, people feel as though their body's the same, their perceptual and sensory motor states are the same, and their narrative ability to report that, think about that, their higher level metacognitive states and narrative reportage, they are intact, but affect is missing. Affect has been, if you like, detached or taken out of this model that's otherwise intact, and it feels as if they feel detached and on the outside of experience. That's why they report they feel as if they don't exist, but they don't say they don't exist because the model is basically intact, just with this subtraction of its affective component ability. Now, pain, and that is as a result of unpredicted deactivation of the anterior insula, because the anterior insula is precisely the structure that integrates all the processing that does those kind of evaluative emotional processes and produces affective responses. Now, in pain asymbolia, which is reported as a kind of restricted depersonalization, that is actually a problem at the lower level, because pain asymbolia is a problem at the lower level of the posterior insular cortex, which is more at the level of the sensory integration, not the emotional interpretation. So in pain asymbolia, nociceptive signals are not incorporated in the bodily self, or incorporated in the bodily self model. So that's a kind of early process. So once again, in pain asymbolia, you've got an intact self model, bodily self model, affective and narrative, but somehow nociceptive signals aren't being incorporated into that model. So, and since they're not incorporated into the model at all, then they won't be transcribed at the effective levels of self-modeling, and then the mind is left with, well, I'm experiencing nociceptive signals, but they're not incorporated in the kind of bodily self-model at the basic level, so they're not mine, so to speak. I'm anthropomorphizing on behalf of your brain here. And then since they're not incorporated in the bodily self-model, they're not going to be affectively interpreted at higher levels of emotional self-modeling. And once again, the subject is left at this kind of narrative level, just reporting on the subsequent experience. It feels like the pain is not happening to me. Okay, and so is this self-modeling theory? Well, this self-modeling theory comes from, of course, active inference and predictive processing theories, right? And this is from Seth and Friston. They say that on this theory of interoceptive, my slide here, am I going the right way? On this theory of that, feelings are generated at the bottom level by this kind of successive interpretation in terms of models which are ultimately top-down. And within this framework, as I said, the anterior insular cortex is specialized to allow us to integrate information about body state, to feel its significance. And the point about the self-modeling theory is those feelings of significance or affective feelings are attributed to a unified persisting entity, the self, okay, just the self model. I'm just repeating here what I've said. Okay. And as they say, this is another way to put it, what I've just said, emotion and embodied selfhood are grounded in active inference of those signals most likely to be me. In other words, as you go through the world, your mind needs to model the consequences of your actions, and the consequences of those actions are going to be, interoceptive, internal bodily, and also they're going to be emotional and affect. And so at any given time, we have a self-model which is predicting how our actions with the world will make us feel and what the kind of sensory consequences of those actions will be at all levels, from homeostasis, body integrity, and so forth. And as they say, the metacognitive and narrative I, or as I've put it to simplify, you've got kind of basic bodily self, you've got, and that gets transcribed and interpreted as a affective or emotional self. And then at the top level, we report and communicate that with the narrative self. Basically, the self is there to serve as to represent the source of endogenous signals arising from inside and to be the target of internal regulation. And this goes back, Craig's papers in the early 2000s, to put it this way, that, within the posterior insula, that does the basic bodily stuff, heartbeat, oxygenation, energy depletion. And then those representations of basic body state get progressively remapped at higher levels, exploiting more higher and amodal cognitive processes until we get to the anterior insula. The anterior insula has to communicate with these other systems of perception, memory, inference, imagination, to tell you the experience, to tell you what the meaning or the significance of all these bodily changes is, and should these bodily changes, are they adaptive in this situation? I'm riding my bike uphill, high heartbeat, fine. My heart's racing when I'm having a conversation with my wife. This is bad. Right? This is kind of anxiety, and so forth. Okay, I can skip that. This is just, to say that the anterior and posterior insula, they are hubs. They are not a place where they are not the kind of, there's not like a self module, a bodily self module and a affective self module. It's more that they are kind of integrative hubs that basically direct traffic, is a good way to put on it. Or another way to think of it is they're like the read-write head on a Turing machine, right? They are coordinating and doing stuff. They're integrating stuff across the brain to this particular task, all right? And they communicate with other hubs, prefrontal and amygdala, which are very important for collecting information for the evaluation. The prefrontal cortex, more about collecting information for at the kind of conceptual level, thinking about, have I offended someone? Is that why they are, is that why they're angry or ignoring with me? Is that because of that kind of thing? Whereas the amygdala is more like coordinating information about basic perceptually driven stuff. Someone raises their voice or puts on an angry expression, and within a couple of 100 milliseconds, I feel a response to that. So, all right. So where are we? To summarize, right? These are just a couple of quotations about the insula from various things. Let's just read one, right? The convergence of multimodal sensory information and ability to read out subjective states explains why the insula is intimately involved in affective processing. Correct. Okay, it's functionally important for detecting salient information and interfacing between physiology and higher order cognitive systems. And it's why it is so functionally ubiquitous and connected with so many things to form a salience detection network. It allows us to feel how things matter. Okay, but within the predictive processing and active inference, it's not just that you feel salience. Salience means salient to me, relevant to the organism and its prospects. Right? Something can't be salient unless it's relevant to a goal. Relevant to a goal of survival or salient to a goal of, maintaining social relationships or achieving some ambition. So salience is not something in itself. Salience is relative to particular goals of organismic survival or organismic prospering at various levels. And in order to do that, the mind needs to model itself as the bearer of the goals, as the thing whose prospering or not is affected by its actions. And now here's the thought that is if you have, just like you have bodily states like interoception, you have affective states like anxiety or depression. And what those states do is they tell you how you're prospering. They tell you how you're prospering bodily, and they tell you how you're prospering emotionally, which is great. And the good thing about that is then you can act, right? You can perform your active inference of foraging in the world for solutions, of moving around and sampling sensations and trying out activities and so forth. All these kind of ways of engaging with the world that is going to optimize, your ability to build a model of yourself as a functioning system. But you don't actually have to fine-tune all the kind of the mechanisms and low-level systems. And that's good because we can't, right? So if you think about fatigue, I cannot go in and change the metabolism of all my cells. I can't go in and change adenosine levels, and I can't change the balance of serotonin and acetylcholine across my brain. But I can go to sleep. So I manage the feeling of exhaustion, and then I wake up feeling better, having optimized my organism. I optimize my organism by managing my feelings. And similarly, at a sort of higher level of the emotional functioning, I optimize my organism by managing affective or emotional feelings. So, if I feel sad, I withdraw from life and avoid the contexts that make me sad. If I feel happy, then I'll keep doing what I'm doing. If I feel amused or interested or engaged, then that'll lead me to kind of pursue and keep performing the actions that are rewarding, and so on and so on. And so life then becomes a matter of acting to regulate affect by active inference as a proxy for minimizing predictive error, or in other words, optimizing organismic function across the functioning of the organism. So in other words, and the self here is the thing. If the self is modeled as the thing which sustains these feelings, and the thing whose feelings can be changed by active inference or action, then that's the role of the self. The role of the self is to be the entity, okay, that we can manipulate. Okay, so in this sense, active inference is like a proxy for overall organismic regulation. Okay, so the self, the feeling of being a unified, persisting self, allows us to get through the world by manipulating our feelings. So the self model is like the aeroplane icon on a control panel on a plane. Right? So the pilot flies a Boeing 737 or 747 or whatever by manipulating the controls, and he can see on his panel, the little model of the plane banking or going up and down. Well, that's great, because the pilot has no access to the electronics, the software, the hydraulics, all the mechanisms, right? The pilot's not going to go back down to the tail and try and, change the ailerons or anything like that. And the pilot's not going to go in there and, mess around with the software of the computer that controls the system. That's all delegated, right? That's all way down. All the pilot has to do is manipulate the icon. And that's all we have to do. We have to just act to make ourselves feel better. And the self is just the target of that regulatory actions. I'll skip this now, because I think I must be, I'll finish. I'm really running out of time. So to sum up, for our case of the kotar delusion and these other things, well, in the kotar delusion, what happens is you have a version of what these theorists, Stepan and Al, call catastrophic dysregulation. So in the case of NDMR and encephalitis, right, cellular metabolic function, the whole thing is kind of out of whack because of this pervasive inflammation across the brain. And so there can't be any kind of low-level signaling that's working. And at the higher, more representational levels, you're not getting any kind of consistent, accurate representations when it's kind of converted into computational language. So the brain is dysregulable and the body is dysregulable. So the system learns that as a regulatory system, as a target of regulation, it doesn't exist. Of course, that's just to say the self model disappears, but you can still feel your body. It's just that those bodily feelings aren't integrated into a model of something that you can change and regulate and predict and anticipate. Okay, so that's catastrophic dysregulation. So how about that? My final slide has got a typo on it, so I'll change that after this. But just to remind you, and I'll close off now because we've been going for too long, but Descartes famously said that states like hunger and thirst, they teach us that we're not present in our bodies as a sailor in his ship, but we are closely joined and intermingled with it. So I compose a single thing with it, with my body. I am my body. I feel like I am my body. We might say within predictive processing that the experience of being the subject of interoceptive and affective experiences produces the feeling, the inference that those experiences belong to a simple, unified thing. And the more that I succeed in controlling myself by regulating my experiences, my interoceptive and affective experiences, the more I learn that I am that thing. When I eat, I'm satiated. When I achieve a goal, I'm happy, and I'm worried, and I resolve my worries. But states of intractable dyshomeostasis teach us the reverse. In severe cases, like NDMR encephalitis, the mind has to learns that there's no viable regulatory target because experience is chaotic and unpredictable. So if you can't keep entropy at bay, we're back now. Can't keep entropy at bay at the most basic level, by having a kind of model that works, then your biological functioning is messed up and you've got no physiological control. All the signaling goes to pieces. You can't minimize variational free energy. And that is at the representational level, the self-model disintegrates. There's no kind of self-model that predictably enables you to regulate yourself. And you're just left with this kind of chaotic experience in the kotar delusion, which you report with the kind of the shadow. That's all you've got left is, linguistic functioning. You've just got linguistic functioning. Whoops. Okay. You've just got the reporting, talking. So that one kotar patient famously said, I'm just a voice, and if that goes, I won't be anything. If my voice goes, I'll be lost and I won't know where I've gone. So this is the patient's only response to this intractable sense of bodily affective entropy, the linguistic shadow, the narrative I, completely disconnected from the structure of bodily and affective experiences that normally anchor it, because the self-model has fallen to pieces. And I should stop there because I've been going for a long time.
Thank you.
I do.
You can unshare the screen and we can talk a little bit. It's just as long as you'd like. So
yeah, sure.
Same button as to share, and then you can.
Oh, yeah.
Cool. I wrote down a ton of stuff. There were some questions in the chat, so thanks for the awesome talk. I'll start with one of Dave's questions. So Dave had written, does your evolutionary and neurological exploration of delusion, especially of the pathologies of the prefrontal cortex functional connectivity, preclude the validity of psychological approaches, or how do psychological and psychosocial approaches benefit from incorporating these kinds of methods and findings?
Okay, well, that's a very good question. I don't think they preclude at all, right? I think they're vital to the psychological approach. I mean, I did write it's a chapter in a book I wrote a while about this, but there's a bad tendency in psychiatry in the world to think, okay, you've got psychological approaches, you've got people's thoughts, their experiences and feelings, and then you have the kind of things that biological psychiatry does, molecular level interventions with receptors and serotonin, and that they never talk to each other, right? And so you have a disease model of mental illness and you have a psychosocial model of mental illness in all this. But clearly that's wrong, right? And it's got to be wrong, because if you think of just an example like astigmatism or macular degeneration, that's something that you experience at a personal and an experiential level as loss of part of your visual field. If you've got a black spot in your visual field, that affects how you experience the world, how you get around it, how you interact with other people. And there's a mechanical explanation there, which is in terms of the visual cortex or the retina or whatever, and the capillaries and all that okay, well, why would it be the case? And if someone said to you, oh, well, look, we could only have like a personal level, an experiential, phenomenological account of visual experience, you'd say that was mad. You'd say, I want to go to the eye specialist and he knows all about, how diabetes produces this thing, because we have a mechanical thing. But not only that, the mechanical explanation depends on a computational explanation of how vision works. These cells in the retina get bombarded by photons. They progress, and the mind progressively reconstructs an image of the causes of that bombardment, and that's our visual experience. So I can tell you why macular degeneration, at any level, at the level of the retina or why visual cortex is going to affect your experience. And we think that's all in order, and we think that's exactly the way to do it. Why wouldn't we think of that for the kotar delusion, or for any psychiatric disorder, anxiety or whatever? It's not that you've got this kind of autonomous level of molecular level interventions, and then you've got some phenomenological level of experience and thinking. I mean, the one depends on the other. I just think that So in my view, what we're trying to do is is trying to understand what's happening in the intervening level. And that's what theories of visual processing do, you know. You've got artificial theories and you've got neurological theories, and they come together. And that's what the active inference self-modeling theory is supposed to do in these cases of pathologies of self-awareness. You have a kind of experience of yourself has changed. And we know that that's because something is happening in your body and brain. How are we supposed to explain that? We not just correlate the change in experience with the low-level cause. We want to say that's because these changes in your body and brain are organized to do this information processing, kind of computational representational functions. And when you get these low-level changes, they compromise this functioning, this computational level working, with the result that you have these experiences. And it goes the other way. You know, when you get information from the world, it has to filter all the way down by being represented, processed somehow. And, you know, we have to take a stand on the nature of the computation, whether it's wide, narrow, symbolic, neural network, whatever. You know, that's ongoing project. So that's my thoughts on that topic.
Thank you. So the next question is from Dean, who wrote, does the disassociation of feelings leave the person not able to make a plan because in some way their predictive model has been compromised? So how do these people, you know, do they grasp objects appropriately? Could they get across town on the bus? What level or in what ways is their action prediction changed?
Good. Yeah, well, I think, you know, I think people who are very affectively flattened, right, and depersonalized, I think planning is an issue for them, precisely because, you know, of the idea that, you know, if you're trying to decide where to go for holidays or whether to get married or whether to quit your job, it's not just a sort of cold cognitive process of weighing the costs and benefits. Those things have to be felt, right? You know, if you decide, am I going to go to Hawaii where it's warm and pleasant, or am I going to go to Alaska and go skiing? Well, how you mentally rehearse those options and how that makes you feel determines the decision, you know. And if you decide to get divorced or get married, it's not just, oh yeah, you know, if I get married, this and this and this will happen, and if I get divorced, the likelihood of this. It's more like that makes you feel a certain way. So if your life becomes affectively flattened so that perception and cognition of all the various options for action are now effectively neutral, it does make it very hard to plan and engage. And in the end, I think what you find in depersonalization is people just kind of go through the motions with their habitual actions. You know, so if you're a bus driver or a university lecturer or a husband and parent, but you feel depersonalized, then you keep doing what you're doing, but you feel like just an empty shell going through the motions. But those people have a lot of difficulty coming up with a coherent alternative plan. It's like, why don't you do something else? Why don't you, you know? But we see this actually, you know, even in everyday cases of life. You know, you might know that it would be good if you took up exercise, or it would be, you know, as a objective piece of knowledge, it would be great if I took up, you know, bike riding, or if I went on a diet, or if I, you know, whatever, if I moved cities. But you just know that as a kind of, you know, piece of information. It won't make you do it unless that somehow can click into your affective self-model. It's like, yeah, it's me. I can kind of imagine myself as, you know, whatever it is, riding up a hill, walking up you know, having some future that I can actually inhabit, not just intellectually, but also emotionally and personally.
Cool. Just one thought on that, and then I'll read a question from Dave. Is like, in a way, society is a big top down. Like in active inference, we talk a lot about nested systems, and you focused on sort of the level of bodily integrity and the brain body. But in a sense, the social structure, our niche, scaffolds our behavior, whether it's, hey, it doesn't matter if you don't like broccoli, you're going to put that fork in your mouth, or whether it's some other type of decision. They're top-down priors that actually structure our decision-making and planning in the absence of precision or of a good way to plan. So just really interesting there.
I think that's exactly right. And, I think this is your point exactly applies really, really well to addiction. There's a woman called Hannah Pickard who writes extensively on addiction. And what she points out is that an addict can know that if they stop taking drugs, it would be better for them. But so what? What they need to be able to do is project themselves into the non-addicted future where they're living, engaging in the world, and they're getting positive feedback from the world. But she says, to pick up your point, that's very hard to have a model of yourself like that without social scaffolding, without social structure, without a kind of positive feedback and structure from a world around you. So the thought is the self that you are is, as you say, your priors, your predictions. They're not just about internal modeling, they're also about the priors, expectations, and plans and reinforcement that you get from being immersed in a sort of social milieu. And for addicts, that's not there. They can't imagine, they have no model of themselves as functioning in an alternative social milieu. So when they get out of jail or get out of rehab, unfortunately, they get back in their old social milieu, the familiar triggering situations and the familiar social environment, and that kind of activates their self-model as someone who does this, does that. And and she says, when you ask them to reflect on what it's like as a non-addict, imagine they can't. So there's a kind, she said, it induces in them a kind of existential terror because they really can't imagine themselves as a non-addicted life. It's kind of it's an empty future for them, partly because she says there's no viable social scaffolding to support their life in that world. So your point is, I think, plays really well into that literature.
And what you said there, what is it like to be, in that case, not addicted to a substance or a behavior? It's kind of a subtle allusion to the famous philosophical tradition of what is it like to be a bat, to be an ant colony,
Right,
etc.
exactly.
And when you brought up, I think even at the beginning, you said, what is it like to feel you don't exist? That this idea of negative space and of negation came up in such interesting ways in the talk. Like if you ask somebody, what does it feel like to exist? It's like, that's 99% of the discourse, or, that's the mystery. But then by drawing our attention, well, what would it feel like? Counterfactual, important for active inference. What would it feel like to not exist? As like, I know I'm not feeling that. So what is that one? And then what's the other side of the coin of feeling like I don't exist? It's like feeling like I am in control. Like I am steering the ship. So that was such a cool connection.
That's I think that's the point I wanted to get at. Why I like the active inference framework for this is because the feeling of being me, a lot of people tell you, oh, well, if you have a perceptual experience, then someone's having it. An experience has to have an experiencer or something like that. Or how can you not feel like you're me if you have a body? You can see your body, touch your body and feel it. But that's not what we're talking about. The feeling of being me is the feeling of being in charge, the feeling of being the thing that I can manipulate in order to bring about all these experiences. Right? And you can still have experiences, right? You can still have plenty of experiences, but if you lose the feeling that those experiences are things that you can change and manipulate dependent on your intentions, then you lose the experience of being you. And that's at a high level. But the same thing, imagine the thing going right down, really low. Your hypothalamus is sending signals to raise your heartbeat and not getting any feedback. Your heartbeat stays low, stays obstinately low or obstinately high. It's the same thing. I'm not getting any traction here. Obviously, a hypothalamus doesn't think that, but, imagine a bacterium that's trying to contract its membranes to turn left to pursue a sugar gradient, and nothing's happening. It's keeping getting this kind of obstinate feeling that I'm not in charge anymore. I've got no model of myself that's working to give me the feeling of being me. And that's in such a case, the system still has sensory experience, still got activity at its receptors and stuff is happening, but it's just not a regulatory target anymore.
And that makes me think about when you talked about the people who are suffering from pain, but they're disassociated from it. It feels like it's not their pain. It's a little wordplay, so it's not a philosophical argument, but gnosis and nociception, it's like
Yeah.
there's the knowledge of pain, but actually
Yes.
it's almost separable from the suffering.
Correct.
And so this is an extreme case where the gnosis of nociception has been entirely separated from the narrative of the self. It's like, yeah, there is pain in the arm, but that's not
Exactly.
me, or it's not part of my narrative. And so
Yeah.
it doesn't bother the person psychologically.
That's exactly right. There's damage to the body that I inhabit, is basically what the brain is saying. This body that I live in is damaged, but it's not my damage.
Now, do they ever ask whose is it, or does it just not seem to be like, oh, it's just like, oh, someone's car, someone's parked outside? Or is it like, I'm trying to solve who?
No. The really interesting thing, I mean, the early cases, the really interesting thing about pain asymbolics is that, they don't take any action to avoid pain. So that in that sense, that's really bad. And so, but it's not quite the same as congenital insensitivity to pain, which is a problem with the receptor level, right? Those people don't detect pain, and so they're in a bad way. They put their hand on a burning stove, they break their legs, and they just don't feel. They don't even have the bodily sensation. But pain asymbolics, they have the bodily sensation, but they don't annex it to themselves.
Well, it points to different roles for different receptors. So I want to ask about the NMDA receptor, which you kind of brought up in the beginning. What does the NMDA receptor do neurologically, or why is it associated with that phenotype?
Right. Well, now now I'm out of my league. I think that kind of encephalitis is a inflammatory thing, right? It's an inflammatory response, and so when it hits those receptors, I think it's just because NDMA is it's so widespread throughout the brain. I think it's I'm talking out of turn here, right? So it's not my field. So cancel this. But I think it's like a catalyst or modulator for so many metabolic functions, right? It's involved in everything as a kind of very fundamental thing. So when you mess with it, you pretty much that's why you get this kind of catastrophic dysregulation across the brain. That's the thought. It's one of these things. It's like adenosine or something like that. That these metabolism depends on that, and if you mess that up, or what's another one? The ketones. If you get a buildup of phenylketone in the brain, it's this tiny chemical, but tiny levels of this chemical can just destroy everything, produce mental retardation, mutism, motor disorders. It's a catastrophe, an absolute catastrophe, because the cellular level functioning is so dependent on these nano level adjustments of these basic things.
That speaks to two dimensions of the challenge, which is the multi-scale systems. There's little things like molecules, and there's big things like people, and then also the transdisciplinarity. And it's like, we shouldn't have one story for one level from one discipline, and then a separate discipline and a separate story. We need something like an integrated approach. What's that going to be?
That's exactly right. And so where I came into this when I was, when I got into philosophy, was people thought, well, what's the integrative story going to be? Well, it's some kind of computational story, top-down classical computational modeling, CPU, modular inputs, modular outputs. That's one way. It's a kind of broad brush approach. Then you have neural network stories. And then you have, deep learning stories and all these different architectures. And now you have active inference. And it depends what you think active inference is going to, how it's going to play out. I mean, if you think of active inference as, at the biophysical level, it sounds right, but it's very abstract, right? It treats the human organism as like a physical system in space. It's like a self-organizing asteroid or something like that. It's really the same laws of physics apply. And then you have the kind of Bayesian implementations of active inference. It's an interesting question, whether you think the brain is actually Bayesian. Because a lot of psychologists will tell you that the brain departs from Bayesian optimal reasoning almost everywhere and almost always. So yeah.
Cool, very interesting, and welcome back, Dave. So one of the questions from Dave was, have you looked at functional delusions socialized as in mobs or depth psychological?
No, I'm still on the standard curriculum of delusions and misidentification, kotar delusions, schizophrenic delusions. Now, I haven't talked about math psychology and depth psychology. I have some thoughts, but I mean, clearly, like self-modeling applies, right? If you're talking about how ideas propagate in populations, then I guess you could say those ideas which are most consistent with a self-model are going to be more easily absorbed and stabilized, within the individual. So it's going to be very hard to get traction for an idea or an ideology that doesn't fit with a self-model. And probably self-models are, since they're constructed to regulate affective states, that tells you that the ideas which propagate and stabilize are going to be those which get traction with people's affective self-model, what that make them feel a certain way, rather than a kind of abstract intellectual argument. You're not going to persuade an anti-vaxxer by giving them statistics, and you're not going to get a kind of propagation of a wave of something across social media on the basis of, a rational inference. But that's, I don't have anything super much to say about that.
Very true that we see sharing and activation patterns in the sort of global brain based upon affect, not veracity or accuracy or any other feature. And maybe that speaks to another one of Dave's questions, which was, how does your work illuminate the notion of cognitive dissonance or consonance? Even in his technical work, Leon Festinger seems not to succeed in building a credible dynamics of compatibility and incompatibility among psychic atoms. Relevant passages of Gregory Bateson's essays in Steps Towards an Ecology of Mind seem similarly limited. So whether or not you've read those specific texts, like
I haven't read those specific things, but I suppose one way of thinking of it is within the kind of active inference or within the predictive processing framework is, if you get some discrepant information that contradicts a self-model or contradicts a predictive model, you have, some choices. You can revise the model, that's, perceptual inference, as they say, or you can explore the world and try and get some further information to confirm your model. That seems to be the active inference approach. And obviously life is a balance, right? Life is a balance between the two. Keep your model or get some more information. But it seems like if we take the scientific analogy of hypothetical inference, often what people do with discrepant information is just compartmentalize it. They just put it away. And scientists have no one throws out a good scientific theory just because of some discrepant evidence, even if that can't be reconciled. Right now, no one's chucking out the theory of evolution because someone came up with a wacky organism or a wacky function. It's like, there's got to be some explanation. I don't know what it is, but we'll just keep doing our thing and hope that eventually it'll be realized. So I don't think there's these ideas of kind of updating or upgrading hypotheses in the face of a flux of new information. That's actually not true, because we can't be that sensitive to information. That would be mad, right? So, and I guess if you have a certain self-model that's getting around the world and functioning, if you're a highly religious person or something like that, and you live in a religious community, and you go to college and, read Dawkins or something like that. Well, I mean, you have a choice. You can throw out your whole self-model and your whole worldview, or you might just think like many surgeons, scientists, and otherwise rational people. Okay, this is my life in the hospital where I'm a neuroscientist or whatever, and this is my life at home where I'm a preacher and a family patriarch of a religious community. Because complete consistency across all the levels and all the functions is too much. But I would say because it threatens a kind of self-model. It's not because it, that kind of compartmentalization is not so much a matter of intellectual consistency, so much as consistency with the self-model.
And very importantly, that the self-model includes the sensory evidence and that meta model. So even though my background is in evolutionary biology, very early I realized that people who believe in evolution, people who believe in creation, every other flavor, look at a tree and see evidence for their world model. So that's the starting point for the discussion, not that you see the evidence, but that everybody sees evidence confirming their worldview. And that's a very different discussion than the dogmatists who might be on any side.
Either side, right. And no one's going to come to the topic with no model. And it's going to say, put aside your preconceptions. Well, there's no such thing, right? So,
Yes, definitely. And that is relevant for the cognitive bias and AI bias discussion in these future systems. Well, we'll have an unbiased system. What is that even going to mean?
Yeah, exactly. And that is the strength and weakness of the Bayesian thing, isn't it? Because the Bayesian idea is, you start ab initio and then you get some evidence and you update your model, and you get some more evidence and you update your model, and it's on, but you've got to start from somewhere. And so much of the action in Bayesian theory is in the priors. But there's no theory internal to Bayes which will tell you where your prior assumptions about how much weight to give incoming evidence is going to come from.
It's a little bit more like blockchain with the way that we can make our priors explicit. You don't step around this issue by using frequentist statistics or by casting tea leaves. So at least we can have a discussion. Hey, I use different priors. I got a different answer versus we use radically different families of priors and hyperpriors, and we're converging on a similar action. So maybe that speaks to at least this action being appropriate, if not it being the ultimate.
That's a very good point. It's not as though anyone else has a solution to where do we start from? What are our foundational assumptions? So it's a bit rude to criticize Bayesians for saying there has to be a lot of action in the priors, right? Or there has to be a lot of information in the priors to get the project off the ground. True. But the same with anyone, Chomskyans or anyone. They just, exactly.
So one other phrase or piece that came to mind was almost like parametric hysteresis. The idea that although most sensory evidence is sort of just sloughed off, kind of like Teflon on our mind, you look away, it's just totally gone. There are traumatic experiences. And then on the other side, there are healing modalities, whether it's a healing experience or a biochemical intervention. There are sort of like, there's interventions that restructure our model, and we can think about that in active inference perspective. So I just wondered, like, philosophically or from any view, how do we think about these kinds of changing events, whether kind of changing in a negative way like a trauma or in a positive way like healing? How do we scaffold for that?
Well, that is actually a really good question, because in the case of psychiatry, it seems like almost all therapies are equally good and equally bad. Right? Like none of them really work in a way that we can kind of predict or explain. There's only statistical correlations. Some people took antidepressants and a certain proportion get better, but then they relapse. Some people went to a therapist or cognitive CBT. Some get better, some relapse. So what kind of interventions work is really interesting, and the kind of restructuring, and that's part of the motivation, I think, for psychedelic approaches to psychiatry, where it's like, okay, one thought might be, look, we can't really have a successful intervention, because that would require you to rebuild or remodel yourself. It's not just changing your perception and changing your experience. It's the way you incorporate that in your whole kind of regulatory framework. How are we going to do that? Well, maybe with 10 years of therapy and, lots of patient reconstruction, or sometimes a life-changing event. People give up drugs because, for some reason, it's a life-changing event, or they just grow out of it, people say. But it's hard to systematize that, isn't it? But with psychedelics, what people are saying is, well, let's disrupt their self-model. Let's kind of, for a while, let's introduce maximum entropy into the system again, so that they experience life briefly, hopefully safely, with a lot of their self-model disintegrated.
Yep.
And so they get to see life for once unfiltered. Normally everything is filtered. How does this matter to me, in relation to my history, my plans, the other people that matter to me? All of life is, just being filtered at every level like that. And that's very hard to experience life without that filter. And psychedelics give you a brief, immersive, very destabilizing experience of life unfiltered. And maybe from that can be a starting point for something that's good.
Classic William Blake Doors of Perception idea, and also the Rebus work by Friston and Carhart Harris, as well as Adam Safron, and actually asking, like, maybe there's certain aspects that these neurochemical interventions, they strengthen. Maybe it's not just this across the board weakening of our world model, but there are certain levels of analysis in which things might be strengthened. And
right.
On this note, though, of the treatment and the recovery, one of the very early slides, I think it was Mr. A, was the patient, and then came in initially presenting some phenotypes, and then there was plasma exchange. And it said after a few plasma exchanges, he had improved, and then he said this other thing. And so I thought, interesting treatments. What does it say about the body and the brain, or what made those doctors go for the plasma exchange? And was it with who, or why did it matter?
Right. Well, because they had this idea that they had this idea that inflammation, was the core of a lot of these the core of a lot of the symptoms. When you look at depression and you look at psychiatric disorders, people often get wrapped up in the sensory experience and the cognitive experience. People say things that are so crazy, and the thing is, why would you say that? Why are they so irrational? And people start at that level, and they talk to them and they say, try and understand their life experience and all this or whatever. But the view of these guys in Mexico was, look at the other symptoms. Look what's happening. The guy is pissing his pants, is shitting himself, hasn't been to sleep for 3 days, and then he sleeps for 2 weeks. And he doesn't want to eat anything, hasn't eaten for a week. So this is like really basic. It's really basic functioning is out of control now. And that looks like it. Maybe that's a kind of, and we know that inflammation does affect homeostasis really badly. And so that was their thought. Let's and then let's test them for all these antibodies for encephalitis, and they find it. So plasma exchange is the treatment for that. And then, of course, you might think, oh well, all right, but that's not something you're going to repair straight away. When you've gone from homeostatic catastrophe to a bit of reintegration, you're still going to be left with the cognitive level has to get back in touch with. If you're thinking of those kind of levels of organization and systematic functioning and interactioning, well, okay, You change the molecular level function, you don't change everything straight away, which is why it's a very nice study by Catherine Harmer, give people antidepressants. Right? You think, well, okay, give people antidepressants, well, you've changed their serotonin levels within an hour. Right? So you brought their serotonin level across the brain back to an hour. Why aren't, if the serotonin theory of antidepressant is right, why don't they feel better? Why don't they change their pattern of thinking? It does affect some very kind of low-level perceptual processing, though. So their patterns of gaze, depressive people, their saccades are very avoidant. If you show them emotional faces or something, they don't look at the nose, the eyes, the mouth. Their eyes automatically avert. And people with anxiety and so on. So they're not getting any positive, emotional feedback from their social world. But if you give people antidepressants, that pattern of saccades changes within a few hours. So it's almost like you're giving them the ability now to do some active inference and reacquire some new information about their world. So if they go around the world luckily and people smile at them and laugh and talk with them, then they're getting some new information, but that's not going to disrupt straight away all the high level models that they've built. You're not going to change that's not going to happen straight away.
And that story about the serotonin story, I've personally felt is that disciplinary hierarchy. It's like, well, we know how this drug works. Look at my simulation of how it binds to the receptor.
Yeah, exactly.
You bring up, but then if it did that, and that's simply how it worked, if it weren't just, changing a complex biological system, then
Exactly.
wouldn't the time course of action be very different? And
Exactly.
it's a looking where the light is, because we can make these simulations with a docking of a molecule, but as yet we lack some of these layers in between
Absolutely.
the vibrating molecule and our own phenomenology, which is sort of that fog of experience that we're exploring together.
Yeah, no, I absolutely 100% agree. And I think, but most of my practicing psychiatrist colleagues and, collaborators, they would agree too. But there's a big pharmaceutical industrial complex, that has an interest in thinking, persuading people otherwise, and also people are desperate. Yeah.
Can't wait till we have big prior and big precision.
Yeah, exactly.
You brought up the Australian philosopher Colin Klein, who
Right.
I was familiar with because of the collaboration with Andy Barron, actually about basal experience in honeybees and in insects. So it just was an interesting connection with
Yeah.
thinking about, okay, if we're going to take this sort of bottom-up computational approach, then where do we take that in not just the clinical, but in the evolutionary context?
Yeah, no, he's a great philosopher for sure, and he's really got his finger on the pulse of all the, I think, cross-disciplinary, material that you need to do that kind of thing well. He's really good like that.
Here's another, just in these last few minutes, a question from the chat. CB
Sure.
wrote, any thoughts about the role of non-synaptic information transmission across the brain, especially emphatic coupling? Thank you kindly.
Honestly, I don't really know it. I don't, because clearly it's got to have. There's no reason within, say, active inference framework or actually any computational framework to think that the fundamental mechanism has to be synaptic. Although it could be anything, right? How the brain is organizing the body to get through the world, to survive, could be anything. Could help itself to any mechanism, astrocytes, glial cells, whatever the hell, But we have got, we bought into this idea that it's synaptic, probably going back to Hebb and people like that. And neural network theory is that. It's a synaptic theory, right? You've got these units interconnected units with weights, which are supposed to model at some abstract level synaptic functioning, right? We might be off. We might be off track there. But so maybe this is a kind of a good advantage of active inference. It's like at the moment, computational theory is hung up on the synaptic model because that's what deep learning and neural networks are, right? Setting weights across the brain. But that's a very abstract idea of Hebbian. It's a very abstract idea of what Hebb was on about. And most neuroscientists, like I had a guy talking in my class the other day, invited him to give a lecture, who works on dragonfly vision. And he was just talking about neurons in the eyes of dragonflies. He was saying there is all this stuff in there that we don't know. Glial cells, astrocytes, what the hell are they, what they're doing, what they're encoding, how they're encoding it. But he says if you mess with their function, then you mess with the ability of the dragonflies to do their incredibly accurate flying and landing and sensory representation. So, yeah. So maybe the synaptic model is, once again, it's a case of looking where the light is, Artificial neural networks, they're great. They can do a lot of things, but they are a kind of high-level abstraction. Then again, Bayesian models are an even higher level abstraction, if you want to put it that way, because the Bayesian models just say, okay, you've got a system interacting with its environment, and I've got a function that tells you how the system's going to interact with its environment. And I can devolve that into a lot of, if you like, I can devolve that into a lot of subsidiary levels of Bayesian inference, all the way down. But how do they glom onto the actual molecular soup? Don't know. But I mean, that's the job of it, isn't it? That's why I guess still dopaminergic functioning in the brain is still a bit of a triumph, because, understanding the dopamine system is because you have a system whose properties map pretty well to the predictions of formal theory. Of temporal difference learning and reward learning, not perfectly, but it does fit. So that's good. That's good. It does seem to see we're in the ballpark.
Matteo Colombo has a paper on the dopamine signaling about explanatory pluralism from a philosophical perspective, about the way in which the dopaminergic signaling in different ways can be seen as consistent with the precision account, the reward account, or other accounts. And so it's like, maybe let's wait a few decades before we give out the trophies. Let's
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So I'll just
very good point. Yeah, because that's right. Why can't doesn't Friston have a paper on that? Even and actually there are a couple of good papers on that now. Yeah, within the active inference framework, we can conceptualize the dopamine system as fine-tuning patterns of active inference rather than back propagating a reward signal.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I'll just close with this sort of this diptych of questions, a little high road and a low road. One of the paths would be, what research directions do you think are exciting for people to pursue? And the other side is, how do you think, for potentially non-researchers, what you've spoken to today might change the way that they think or act?
I think for researchers, I think any researcher should still keep researching, what they're interested in. Like if you've got a fascination or an interest, there's dragonfly vision, dopaminergic signaling, whatever, I think you should just keep going for it and incorporate active inference or any framework that is helping. I don't think jumping on a bandwagon for any researcher is helpful, although you've got to bear in mind that if you're trying to function in an institutional environment, you're going to be on some bandwagon, right? You're going to be in some lab or some school of thought. But I think you've still got to do what you're interested in rather than promote someone else's program. So I don't have a kind of, I would love to see that that, you know, kind of Fristonian ideas and everything could be put in a intuitive way that made them more accessible for people who were looking for a kind of recipe or something like that, because they're so technical and they're so formal, and it's hard to extract the gold, you know, if you know what I mean. And that's why, yeah. So I think a good suite of examples would be really helpful, like, you know, standard cases that people use to explain it. Would be good, you know, just as, you know, often these examples are wrong, right? So you think of Ma's theory of vision, okay, probably wrong, but at least it kind of gave you a way to understand, you know, what's going on in the visual system, and then you can fine tune it and change it and argue with it and everything like that. But he gave people a way of taking the understanding of perception out of a really kind of technical, specialized framework. And now philosophers talk about it, psychologists, everyone. You know, it's probably become a little bit of an albatross around the neck of, but no one's come up with a but it would be nice if someone could. I mean, because the Ma framework is so clear, right? And it works for active inference too. You can say, well, look, the mind is in the business, and it's what Hoey says, of reconstructing the causal structure of the world, you know, inferring the causal structure of the world outside beyond its boundaries. So it's a very internalist view, but that's a very plausible way of doing it, you know. I think, yeah, I get it, you know. You can explain that to students and to people. Look, the brain is stuck inside its skull. It can't engage with the world. It can only ever do it by proxy, indirectly. And what does it have? Photons hitting sensory receptors. It's got to build the picture, okay, and you know, that's what Ma said, and how he put it in the predictive processing framework. Something like that would be helpful if you get that idea across. You can do it for other modalities, of course, interoception, you know, whatever. Sorry, what was the other question?
So on the non-research frontier is just in the day-to-day. How does this influence how we might think or act just in our day-to-day experiences?
I think it makes a big difference if you think of yourself as, if you think of your behavior as confirming a model. You know, I think it makes a really, really big difference. You know, if you're arguing with your partner, or, you know, stuck in a way of life or ways of, especially social interaction. And think of social interactions, you know, I've got a thought, I've got to try and get a point across, or I've got a goal, I want to achieve a goal, right? I want to make friends with this person, I want to do this, I want to do that. And then you can get pissed off or whatever if it's working or not. But maybe the right way to think of it is, you know, I've got a model of how I function in the world, and you know, my brain has built this picture of how I function in the world, and now I'm bungling around the world trying to optimize it. You know, so what I think of as this kind of, you know, autonomous engagements of this, you know, individual who's above it all and choosing and whatever, and, you know, making decisions, and not really. Maybe what I'm doing is bungling around the world trying to optimize my model, and maybe I can get stuck in a local minima, right? I can get stuck in a, you know, my model's not working. I had this discussion. Maybe, I don't know if you know this philosopher Dominic Murphy. He's a fantastic philosopher of science and psychology. But we would think of, you know, this notion of model, and, you know, a lot of the time what you're doing is brand management. You know, yourself, who you are, is this model that you've made that works for you in your environment, your family as you're growing up, or high school or whatever like this. And you've got this brand now. And unfortunately, or fortunately, that's how other people see you. Your actions are really about getting your brand out there, brand management. And if you identify with your brand, great, you know. But if your brand isn't working for you, and if you just see your actions as, oh God, what I'm doing is kind of finessing and reinforcing and fortifying this model of how I act in the world. Does it have to be like that? You know,
Very nice point that instead of social interactions maximizing my reward, your reward, our shared reward, zero sum, we can actually think about, well, what if we were both reducing our uncertainty about a positive social interaction, what might be known as win-win in the reward paradigm? But here
Yeah,
is
that's a really good way to. It's a really good way to think of it. That's a
cool.
really good way to think of it. Yeah, exactly.
Thank you for this awesome visit. It was really a fascinating talk, and one of in the chat, brilliant practical advice. Thanks, Daniel, and thanks for your guest. So
Yeah,
really,
thanks.
thanks a lot from our lab, and you and anyone else are always welcome to join anytime.
Thank you very much. It was a really great experience. Nice to try these ideas out, and this discussion was really helpful and informed. So thank you very much for the chance. And I'll be propagating. I'll be spreading the news about the lab. So
Thank you.
thanks a lot.
See
Thanks
you.
a lot.
Bye.
See you, everyone. Bye.
Nice talk. Pretty cool.